What if the oldest records on Earth were not describing the first steps of humanity, but its last warnings? What if the clay tablets, star charts, and temple inscriptions reaching back 6,000 years were not myths at all, but memories of a world that ended before history could begin? From the crumbling cities of southern Iraq to the sands of Egypt, from Turkey's sweeping highlands to the frozen archives of Greenland's ice, echoes of a forgotten world linger. Each carved symbol, each celestial observation, each unreal stretch of a king's reign was left behind to protect a story. Today that story sleeps beneath ages of silence, waiting for a mind willing to reconstruct what remains. Before this story pulls you further under, take a second, hit like, and subscribe to the channel. But only if you're drawn to the shadows, where fact and forgotten memory intertwine. And if you're still with me now, share in the comments where you're listening from and what time keeps you company. I imagine echoes of this vanished world crossing oceans and hours to meet you tonight. And so our story begins not with answers, but with dust. In the late 19th century, European archaeologists drove their spades into the plains near ancient Uruk and Eridu. The clay beneath their boots had been baking under the Mesopotamian sun for millennia. What emerged were tablets, thousands of them, stacked like the fossilized memories of an entire civilization. They called these people the Sumerians. And the moment scholars began reading what they'd written, something in our timeline shifted. Because what appeared on those tablets wasn't the fumbling script of a culture just learning to write. It was already precise, systematic, and disturbingly complete. The earliest Sumerian records emerge fully formed around 3500 BC with no gradual evolution leading up to them. Their writing system appears geometrically sophisticated from its first appearance. Their cities were laid out with mathematical precision. Their astronomical observations tracked Venus, Jupiter, and Mars with accuracy that wouldn't be confirmed again until the invention of telescopes. It was as if someone had simply turned on the lights, and there stood an entire civilization already flourishing in the middle of the room. Historians prefer slow progress, one discovery leading to the next, crude tools giving way to refined ones, oral traditions gradually becoming written language. But Sumer disrupts that rhythm. Their own records describe knowledge that was returned to them after a great catastrophe. They speak of a time before kingship, before the flood, when wisdom was given by beings they called the Apkallu, sages who emerged from the waters to teach humanity what had been lost. And though modern scholars dress this language in the comfortable robes of mythology, the clay itself suggests something stranger. Because the Sumerians were not alone in this memory, Egyptian priests inscribed their temples with references to Zep-Tepi, the first time, an epoch of divine rule that preceded the dynasties. Hindu texts describe world ages stretching back tens of thousands of years, ending in cataclysmic floods. The Maya recorded cycles of creation and destruction. Hebrew, Greek, Chinese, and Mesopotamian traditions all preserve the same sequence. An advanced world, a great deluge, a restart of humanity. How could cultures separated by oceans and millennia remember the same catastrophe with the same details? Perhaps memory itself moves like water, seeping into every crack, settling wherever consciousness makes room. Or perhaps the ancients were not inventing stories at all. Perhaps they were remembering when archaeologists excavated deeper into Sumer, they expected to find the crude beginnings beneath the polished surface. Instead, they found older cities, Eridu, the Ubaid settlements showing organized irrigation, temple construction, and trade networks dating back to 5400 BC. Beneath the Egyptian pyramids, they discovered that the Sphinx had been weathered by thousands of years of rainfall in a climate that had been desert for 5,000 years. In Turkey, they unearthed Göbekli Tepe, a megalithic temple complex built 11,600 years ago by people who supposedly hadn't yet discovered agriculture. Everywhere they dug, the evidence pointed backward, further, deeper, older. In the Louvre Museum in Paris, a small clay cylinder sits behind protective glass. The cuneiform inscription describes the construction of a temple to Inanna, goddess of the heavens. But among the dedication lines, one phrase stands out. This is built according to the writings from before the flood. Not built for the first time, built according to ancient writings. It's a quiet confession that even the Sumerians, the civilization we call the first, saw themselves as heirs to something older, something they no longer fully understood but desperately tried to preserve. Sometimes, if you look closely at these artifacts in museum lighting, you can still see fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried. The thumbprint of a scribe who lived 6,000 years ago, frozen in mud. And if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize that those hands were not inventing. They were copying, recording, remembering. The silence between those ancient lines feels heavy. The way a half-finished sentence haunts the air, the way a forgotten name hovers at the edge of the memory. Maybe that's why these records still call to us across the millennia. They remind us that what we call history might only be the chapter that survived the burning. Late at night, when the museum lights dim and the crowds fade, I imagine those clay tablets breathing softly in the darkness, each one holding a fragment of a world we no longer recognize. Each inscription a breadcrumb trail leading back to something vast and forgotten. We think we stand at the beginning of understanding, but what if we're actually standing at the end of remembrance? What if the oldest records on earth were never meant to tell us who we are, but to warn us of who we used to be? As the desert wind sweeps across the ruins of Uruk tonight, carrying grains of ancient dust into another millennium, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story, soft, unfinished, waiting to be remembered again. If the Sumerians claimed their knowledge came from before the flood, then the question becomes unavoidable. What world existed before theirs? And why does every ancient record describe it the exact same way? The answer lies not in what these civilizations built, but in what they remembered while building it. When Sir Leonard Woolley excavated the royal tombs of Ur in 1922, he dug through layer after layer of ordinary debris, pottery shards, brick fragments, the usual archaeological sediment of time. Then, 11 ft down, his shovel struck something that made him stop. A layer of pure water-laid silt, 8 feet thick, sterile, clean. The kind of deposit left behind only by massive flooding. Beneath that flood layer, he found the remnants of an earlier settlement, older pottery, older structures, older lives. And when he consulted the Sumerian tablets describing their own history, he found a phrase that suddenly carried new weight. After the flood swept over, when kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. They had recorded the flood not as myth, as memory. But Woolley's discovery was only the beginning. Because as archaeologists continued mapping Mesopotamia, they found the same flood layer at Kish, at Shuruppak, at Uruk itself, all dated to roughly the same period between 2900 and 3500 BC, and all positioned directly beneath the earliest Sumerian city-states, as if those cities had been built deliberately on top of what the water had taken. Meanwhile, in Egypt, something equally strange was unfolding. French archaeologist Auguste Mariette discovered the Abydos king list carved into the temple walls of Seti I. The list stretched back through dozens of pharaohs past the familiar dynasties into a section labeled Zep-Tepi the first time. According to the inscriptions, this era belonged to the Neteru, divine beings who ruled Egypt for thousands of years before the human dynasties began. The Turin Papyrus, found decades later, listed these pre-dynastic rulers with reigns lasting centuries, some over a millennium. Modern Egyptologists dismissed it as religious theater, but then they began noticing something troubling about Egypt's oldest monuments. The Sphinx, the Valley Temple, the Osirian, all showed signs of erosion caused by sustained rainfall, heavy rainfall, the kind Egypt hasn't experienced since the African humid period ended around 3000 BC, which meant these structures had been standing exposed to the elements for thousands of years before the pharaohs claimed them. The stones themselves were older than the civilization that built around them. Then came Göbekli Tepe. In 1994, German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began excavating a hill in southeastern Turkey that locals had long avoided, calling it cursed. What he uncovered defied every timeline archaeology had carefully constructed. Massive T-shaped pillars weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circular formations, carved with intricate reliefs of animals, foxes, serpents, bulls, vultures, astronomical alignments built into the architecture, a sophisticated understanding of geometry and engineering. The radiocarbon dates came back 9600 BC. That made Göbekli Tepe 11,600 years old, built 6,000 years before Sumer, 7,000 years before the pyramids. At a time when humans were supposedly still hunter-gatherers, learning to domesticate wheat, yet here stood a temple complex that required organization, planning, astronomical knowledge, and a workforce capable of quarrying, transporting, and erecting megalithic stones. And then, after flourishing for perhaps 1,500 years, it was deliberately buried, filled in with rubble, hidden, as if whoever built it wanted to preserve it beneath the earth. The pattern was becoming undeniable. Between 10,000 and 6,000 BC, something catastrophic reshaped the world. Geological records show the global sea levels rose over 400 FT as the last Ice Age glaciers melted, not gradually, but in sudden pulses. Meltwater Pulse 1A, dated to around 12,000 BC, saw oceans rise 65 feet in just a few centuries. Entire coastlines vanished, river valleys flooded, islands disappeared beneath the waves. Ice core samples from Greenland reveal the same story written in frozen layers: rapid climate shifts, temperature swings of 15 degrees within decades, catastrophic flooding events preserved in sediment. The Younger Dryas period, a 1,000-year return to glacial conditions beginning around 10,800 BC, left geological scars across every continent. And during that same window of time, the megafauna vanished. Mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, species that had survived for millions of years, gone within a few thousand. Not slowly, abruptly. What survived were the stories. Sumer remembered a flood that destroyed the world before kingship descended. Egypt remembered the first time before the dynasties. The Hebrew tradition preserved Noah. The Akkadians told of Utnapishtim. Hindu texts described Manu surviving the deluge. Greek myths recalled Deucalion. Chinese records mentioned Gun taming the great floods. Even the indigenous peoples of the Americas, Maya, Hopi, Aztec, carried flood narratives describing a world that ended in water and began again. These weren't borrowed stories. They emerged independently, separated by oceans and millennia, yet all describing the same sequence: an advanced age, a cataclysm, a handful of survivors, and a slow rebuilding. The 6,000-year records we called the beginning of civilization were never describing a beginning at all. They were describing what came after. The Sumerian tablets, Egyptian inscriptions, and megalithic sites weren't primitive attempts at culture. They were reconstruction efforts. Humanity wasn't learning for the first time. It was relearning. That's why writing appears fully formed. Why astronomical observations start at expert level. Why early cities show no developmental curve. They weren't inventing these systems. They were restoring them from fragments of memory, from oral traditions passed down through generations who survived the flood, from knowledge that refused to die, even when the world that created it was washed away. The records that woke the dead world were never meant to tell us how civilization began. They were meant to tell us how it returned. But if these early civilizations were not beginning from scratch, if they were rebuilding something, then the question becomes unavoidable. What exactly were they trying to recreate? The truth should have been visible in the ruins themselves, embedded in their foundations, their pottery, and the slow improvement of their tools. Every civilization is expected to reveal traces of its early years. Rough experiments before refinement, simple forms before sophistication, mistakes layered in the soil as evidence of gradual learning. But when researchers began examining the earliest cities closely, they found something that made no sense. There was no childhood. Take Sumer. By 3500 BC, when its first cities emerge into the historical record, they arrive with irrigation systems already engineered to redirect the Tigris and Euphrates. Not simple ditches, but complex canal networks with flow regulators, drainage systems, and water management sophisticated enough to support populations in the tens of thousands. The mathematics required for this geometry, surveying, hydraulic engineering, appears alongside the cities themselves, fully formed. Their ziggurats weren't crude piles of brick. They were precisely oriented to cardinal directions, built with specific ratios, designed with internal staircases and drainage channels. The Code of Hammurabi, dating to 2100 BC, shows legal thinking already refined. Proportional punishment, compensation for injury, protection of the vulnerable. This wasn't humanity's first attempt at law. It read like a mature legal system being codified, not invented, and their medicine. Sumerian tablets describe surgical procedures, pharmaceutical recipes using over 250 plants, diagnosis protocols for various illnesses. The Edwin Smith Papyrus from Egypt, copied from texts acknowledged to be far older, details 48 surgical cases with anatomical precision. These weren't folk remedies. They were systematic medical knowledge requiring generations of observation and experimentation. Yet all of it appears suddenly with no visible learning curve beneath it. Archaeologists assume the answer must lie deeper in the settlements that came before Sumer. So they excavated further south into the Ubaid period. What they found made the mystery worse. The Ubaid culture, flourishing from 6,500 to 3,800 BC, showed organized society thousands of years before Sumer. Temple platforms, pottery kilns, evidence of long-distance trade networks, settlements arranged in deliberate patterns. These weren't scattered camps of nomads slowly figuring out agriculture. They were planned communities with shared religious practices, standardized pottery styles, and trade connections stretching from the Persian Gulf to Anatolia. The Ubaid people had already solved the problem Sumer inherited, which meant the knowledge went back even further. In 1974, French archaeologist Jean-François Jarige began excavating Mehrgarh in modern-day Pakistan. The site dated to 7000 BC, making it one of the oldest Neolithic settlements in South Asia. What emerged from the excavations stunned the archaeological community. Evidence of dentistry. Actual dental surgery using bow drills to treat tooth decay dated to 7000 BC. 9,000 years ago, someone in Mehrgarh had developed precision tools for medical procedures on human teeth. The site also revealed sophisticated mud brick architecture, granaries designed for long-term storage, trade beads made from materials sourced hundreds of miles away, and evidence of selective breeding in both plants and animals. This wasn't primitive agriculture. It was systematic, planned, and executed with knowledge that should have taken centuries to develop, yet appeared already mature in the archaeological record. Meanwhile, in Neolithic Anatolia, Çatalhöyük presented its own impossibility. Dating to 7,500 BC, this settlement housed up to 8,000 people in interconnected mud brick homes accessed through roof entrances. No streets, no ground-level doors. The entire city was designed as a single integrated structure where people moved across rooftops and descended through hatches into their homes. The walls were decorated with elaborate murals, bulls, vultures, geometric patterns, hunting scenes, obsidian mirrors, textile weaving, organized disposal of the dead beneath house floors. This level of urban planning and social organization wasn't supposed to exist for another 3,000 years. Yet here it stood, thriving in 7,500 BC with no developmental stages leading up to it. Then archaeologists began looking beneath the waves, off the coast of Gujarat, India. Sonar surveys in 2001 revealed geometric structures lying 120 feet underwater near the legendary site of Dwarka. Stone blocks arranged in patterns suggesting walls, platforms, and foundations. If these structures were built when sea levels were lower before the post-glacial flooding, they would date to at least 7,000 BC, possibly earlier. Near Yonaguni, Japan, divers discovered massive stone formations featuring right angles, straight edges, and what appear to be carved steps and platforms. Though hotly debated, the structures sit in a location that was above water only during the last ice age before 10,000 BC. In the Mediterranean, entire Neolithic settlements now lie submerged. Atlit Yam off Israel's coast, Pavlopetri near Greece, structures off Malta that predate the island's famous megalithic temples, all drowned when post-glacial seas rose, taking with them whatever knowledge their inhabitants possessed. The pattern was undeniable. Wherever archaeologists looked deep enough or far enough, they found complexity where simplicity should have been. But then came Egypt, and the timeline fractured completely. When Egyptologists examined the earliest dynasties, the ones marking the official beginning of Egyptian civilization around 3,100 BC, they found stone architecture that shouldn't have been possible. The step pyramid at Saqqara, built around 2,700 BC, wasn't a first attempt at monumental building. It was already sophisticated, requiring advanced knowledge of engineering, quarrying, and geometry. The hieroglyphic writing system appears complete from its first appearance. Not pictograms slowly evolving into language, but a fully functional system with grammar, syntax, and symbolic complexity. The mathematics encoded in the pyramids, phi ratios, astronomical alignments, precise cardinal orientation, suggests knowledge inherited, not discovered. And beneath the dynasties inscribed on temple walls at Abydos and Dendera, priests recorded something troubling. They claimed their temples were restorations built according to a plan which descended from heaven in the time of the ancestors. They insisted they were copying something older, following blueprints from the first time. None of these first civilizations behaved like beginners. They behaved like survivors, people rebuilding from memory, preserving fragments of knowledge they no longer fully understood, but refused to let die. Sumer didn't invent mathematics and astronomy. It remembered them. Egypt didn't discover stone architecture and hieroglyphics. It restored them. Mirgar, Catalhoyuk, the Ubaid culture, the submerged coastal cities. All of them carried forward something older than themselves, like children repeating stories they heard from their grandparents about a world they never saw. But if these societies were not progressing toward knowledge, if they were inheriting it from something that came before, then where did that inheritance come from, and who remembered it first? Their words held the answer, not veiled in myth or obscured by symbol, but spoken directly in the earliest records they left behind. They told us exactly what they remembered. We simply chose not to believe them. The Sumerian king list, compiled around 2100 BC from sources acknowledged to be far older, opens with a line that has troubled scholars for over a century. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it names the kings. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalangar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Badtabira, 43,200 years. 8 kings are listed before the flood, their combined reigns totaling 241,200 years. The text then states, matter-of-factly, then the flood swept over. After the flood had swept over, when the kingship was lowered from heaven, the The kingship was in Kish. After the flood, the reigns become shorter, still impossibly long by modern standards, but gradually decreasing until they reach believable human lifespans around the time of Gilgamesh. The pattern is unmistakable. The list describes a pre-flood world operating under different conditions, followed by a catastrophic reset, followed by a slow return to normality. Modern historians dismiss these numbers as mythological exaggeration, symbolic, metaphorical, but then they examined the Egyptian records and found the same pattern. The Turin Papyrus, sometimes called the Turin King List, presents Egyptian history in reverse chronological order. It works backward through the familiar dynasties, Ramesses, Thutmose, Khufu, then continues past the first dynasty into what it calls the time of the spirits and the followers of Horus. These divine rulers are listed with reigns lasting hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. The Palermo stone, another fragment of Egyptian chronology, records similar pre-dynastic epochs ruled by the Neteru, gods who governed before human pharaohs. Manetho, the Egyptian priest who compiled his history around 280 BC, recorded the same tradition. Dynasties of gods ruling for 13,900 years, followed by dynasties of demigods ruling for 11,000 years, before the first human pharaohs took the throne. Halfway around the world, the Maya preserved an entirely independent chronology that told the same story. The Popol Vuh describes multiple world ages, each one ending in catastrophe, each one followed by a new creation. The current age, according to Maya cosmology, is the fourth or fifth world. The previous ones were destroyed by jaguars, by fire, by wind, and by flood. The Maya long count calendar, which tracks time in cycles of 5,125 years, implies awareness of epochs stretching back over 26,000 years, far beyond the rise of Maya civilization itself. In India, the Puranas describe the Yuga cycles, vast periods of time during which the world passes through golden ages and dark ages before being destroyed and reborn. One full cycle, a Mahayuga, spans 4.32 million years. These aren't vague mythological time frames. They're specific, calculated, and embedded in astronomical observations of precession, the 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis that ancient cultures somehow tracked with precision. The pattern extended beyond king lists and calendars into the stories themselves. In Hebrew tradition, Genesis describes a world before Noah where people lived for centuries, Methuselah for 969 years, Adam for 930. Then came the flood, and lifespans shortened dramatically. Abraham lived 175 years, Moses 120. The same pattern impossibly long lives before the deluge, gradual normalization after. The Akkadian epic of Gilgamesh preserves the flood story in its 11th tablet. Utnapishtim, the Sumerian Noah, describes a world destroyed by the gods, survivors finding refuge in a boat, and humanity beginning again after the waters recede. The Epic of Atrahasis tells the same story with even more detail. Cities thriving before the flood, divine councils deciding to wipe the slate clean, a chosen survivor preserving knowledge for those who would come after. Chinese records describe Gun Yu taming the great floods that reshaped the landscape, preserving civilization through catastrophe. Greek mythology recalls Deucalion and Pyrrha surviving a deluge sent by Zeus to cleanse the earth. Norse traditions tell of Ragnarok, the world ending in fire and flood, then regenerating. Hopi legends speak of multiple worlds destroyed and recreated. Aztec mythology describes 4 previous suns, each ending in destruction. These stories aren't vague or contradictory. They follow the same structure. An advanced world exists. Humanity reaches a peak of knowledge and power. A catastrophic flood destroys most of civilization. A few survivors preserve fragments of the old knowledge. Humanity rebuilds slowly, inheriting what it can. Anthropologists called this convergent mythology, similar stories arising independently because all cultures experience flooding. But that explanation fell apart under scrutiny. These weren't just flood stories, they were civilization reset stories. They described not natural disasters that villages survived, but global cataclysms that erased entire epochs, forcing humanity to start over with only fragmented memories of what came before. And the details were too specific to be coincidental. The Sumerian account places the flood's origin in divine decision. So does the Hebrew version. So do the Greek and Hindu versions. The Maya describe previous worlds ending when the gods grew dissatisfied. The pattern suggests not independent invention, but independent preservation of a shared memory, as if survivors scattered across the world each carried pieces of the same story and passed them down through different cultural lenses. Even more striking, the king lists from separate civilizations all describe the same timeline structure. Long reigns before the catastrophe, shorter reigns after, not random mythological numbers, but a pattern that suggests these cultures were tracking something real. Perhaps not literal lifespans, but dynasties, epochs, or cultural continuity measured in ways we no longer understand. When archaeologists examined the flood layers at Ur, Kish, and Shuruppak, they found something unsettling. The deposits match the time frame these texts described. Not a gradual river flood, a massive inundation event that left sterile silt layers several feet thick. The kind of deposit created by sustained catastrophic flooding. The texts, the archaeology, and the geology were beginning to align. But then geology began to catch up with myth, and the Earth itself revealed that something truly catastrophic had happened. Ice cores pulled from Greenland and Antarctica showed abrupt climate shifts between 12,000 and 10,000 BC. Sediment layers worldwide revealed sudden flooding events during the same period. Coastlines that once held human settlements now lay 400 feet underwater. The geological record preserved exactly what the ancient texts described: a world-ending catastrophe that reshaped continents, drowned coasts, and forced humanity to begin again. These stories weren't religious parables or poetic metaphors. They were eyewitness accounts passed down through enough generations that the details blurred, but the core truth survived. The world had ended once before, and those who lived through it made certain their descendants would never forget. Could these stories be memories, accurate recollections of a real event? And if the flood was real, then what else were they telling the truth about? The evidence was locked in ice, buried in sediment, and submerged beneath hundreds of feet of seawater, waiting for the technology to read it. In the 1960s, geologists began drilling deep into the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, extracting cores that preserved atmospheric records stretching back over 100,000 years. Each layer of compacted snow captured a snapshot of Earth's climate, temperature, precipitation, atmospheric composition, locked in frozen chronological order. What they found in the layers corresponding to 12,000 BC made them recalibrate everything they thought they knew about gradual climate change. The temperature had spiked violently. Within decades, global temperatures surged by up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit. The ice cores showed the transition wasn't gradual, it was abrupt, almost instantaneous on a geological timescale. The world had been locked in ice age conditions for millennia. And then suddenly, it wasn't. The glaciers that had covered North America, Europe, and Asia began to melt. Not slowly, catastrophically. Geologists named it Meltwater Pulse 1A. Between 12,000 and 11,500 BC, global sea levels rose approximately 65 feet in just a few centuries, an average of 5 inches per year, but with surges far more dramatic during peak melting periods. To put that in perspective, if you lived on a coastal plain during this period, the shoreline would have visibly retreated inward during your lifetime. Rivers would have swollen into inland seas, valleys would have become bays, entire landscapes would have drowned within a generation. But meltwater pulse 1A was only the first wave. Around 9000 BC, the Earth convulsed again. Meltwater pulse 1B sent another surge of glacial runoff into the oceans, raising sea levels an additional 25 feet over several centuries. The combined effect of both pulses meant that by 8000 BC, global sea levels had risen over 100 feet from their Ice Age minimum, and they weren't finished. By 6000 BC, the oceans had climbed another 300 feet, stabilizing near modern levels only around 3000 BC. Think about what that means. Between 12,000 and 6000 BC, the exact window the ancient texts describe as the pre-flood and flood epochs. Over 400 feet of coastline vanished beneath the waves. River deltas became shallow seas. Islands became reefs, and since approximately 70% of all human settlements throughout history have been located within 50 miles of a coast, the archaeological record of any Ice Age coastal civilization would now lie submerged on the continental shelf, invisible to traditional excavation. Geologists found the scars everywhere. In the Black Sea, cores pulled from the seafloor revealed a dramatic transition layer, dated to approximately 5600 BC. Below that layer, freshwater lake sediment. Above it, saltwater marine deposits. The evidence suggested that the Black Sea had been a vast freshwater lake during the Ice Age, sitting hundreds of feet below global ocean levels. Then, as Mediterranean waters rose, they breached the Bosporus land bridge in a catastrophic flood, possibly filling the entire basin within months or years, drowning thousands of square miles of settled coastline. In the process, geologists Robert Ballard and William Ryan, who proposed this Black Sea flood hypothesis, noted something chilling. The flood's timing and location aligned perfectly with the dispersal patterns of early Indo-European languages and the geographical origin points of multiple Near Eastern flood myths. The people who lived there didn't just experience a flood. They experienced the end of their world, and they carried that story with them wherever they fled. Meanwhile, underwater surveys along continental shelves worldwide revealed drowned landscapes. Off the coast of India, sonar mapping discovered ancient riverbeds now submerged 400 feet below the surface. Rivers that had carved valleys during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower now drowned and filled with sediment. Marine archaeologists exploring the Persian Gulf found evidence of a vast floodplain that had supported human settlement before 8000 BC, now entirely underwater in the North Sea, between Britain and continental Europe. Researchers discovered Doggerland, a subcontinent-sized landmass that had connected Britain to Europe during the Ice Age. Trawler nets occasionally pulled up Stone Age tools, mammoth bones, and evidence of human habitation from what was now open ocean. Doggerland had been a thriving landscape of rivers, lakes, and marshlands, possibly supporting tens of thousands of people. By 6500 BC, it was gone, first reduced to a scattered archipelago, then swallowed entirely by rising seas. The same story repeated across Southeast Asia, where the Sunda Shelf, a massive landmass connecting Indonesia, Malaysia, and mainland Asia, had drowned between 12,000 and 6,000 BC. Australia had been connected to New Guinea by a land bridge that now lay beneath the Torres Strait. The Bering Land Bridge linking Asia and North America had disappeared beneath the waves. Entire subcontinents had vanished. And wherever geologists looked on land, they found the flood's fingerprints at Kish and Shuruppak in Mesopotamia. Excavations revealed thick layers of water-laid silt, sandwiched between occupation layers, exactly as Woolley had discovered. These weren't typical seasonal flooding deposits. They were sterile, uniform, and far too thick to represent normal river activity. Something catastrophic had inundated these regions, leaving behind geological evidence that matched the Sumerian descriptions precisely. But the floods weren't the only catastrophe. The same ice cores that revealed rapid warming also showed something else. A sudden cold snap beginning around 10,800 BC. Temperatures plunged back toward glacial conditions for over 1,000 years, an event geologists call the Younger Dryas period. Theories about its cause range from meteorite impacts to disruptions in ocean circulation, but the effect was undeniable. Just as the world was warming and humans were expanding, the climate reversed violently, bringing cold, drought, and ecological collapse. This period coincides exactly with the disappearance of Ice Age megafauna, woolly mammoths, saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, dire wolves, American camels, cave bears, species that had survived multiple glacial cycles, suddenly went extinct between 12,000 and 10,000 BC, not through gradual decline, but through rapid population collapse. Some researchers point to human hunting pressure. Others cite habitat loss from climate chaos. But the pattern suggests something more catastrophic. An ecosystem unraveling under compounding pressures, and human societies collapsed alongside them. The Clovis culture of North America, marked by distinctive spear points and widespread mammoth hunting, vanished around 10,800 BC. European Ice Age societies fragmented and migrated. Settlements across the Near East show evidence of abandonment and restructuring during this same window. Archaeological continuity breaks. Cultural markers disappear, population densities decline. Then, slowly, survivors regrouped. New settlements emerged. Agriculture began to spread, not as a sudden invention, but as a gradual rebuilding process that took thousands of years. And when writing finally appeared around 3,500 BC, it carried stories about what had come before. Kings who ruled for impossibly long periods, cities destroyed by floods. Knowledge passed down from survivors of a drowned world. The geology didn't just support the myths, it explained them. The world hadn't experienced a single flood. It had endured a cascading series of catastrophes spanning thousands of years: rapid warming, massive flooding, sudden climate reversals, ecological collapse, and finally stabilization. Anyone living through that sequence would have experienced it as the end of the world, because for their world it was. If great floods wiped the world clean, drowning coastlines and erasing landscapes, then what knowledge survived the water? And who carried it forward into the new world that emerged from the ruins? The survivors carried something with them that water couldn't wash away: the sky. In 1847, British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard excavated the library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh and discovered thousands of clay tablets, including astronomical records that should not have existed. Among them was the Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, dated to around 1650 BC, but copied from sources acknowledged to be far older, possibly originating in the Sumerian period around 3000 BC or earlier. The tablet tracked the heliacal risings and settings of Venus with astonishing precision. It recorded exactly when Venus would appear on the eastern horizon before sunrise, and when it would vanish, reappearing on the western horizon after sunset. The observations were accurate to within a single day across an 8-year cycle. Here's why that matters. Venus follows a complex pattern. It appears as the morning star for several months, vanishes for a period, then reappears as the evening star. Tracking this cycle with precision requires continuous observation over decades, multiple generations of astronomers recording data, comparing patterns, refining calculations. It's not something a civilization just beginning to look at the sky could accomplish immediately. Yet the Sumerian Venus observations appear fully formed in the earliest written records, showing no developmental phase, no trial and error, no gradual refinement. They arrive complete. The same pattern appeared in Egypt. The Great Pyramid at Giza, constructed around 2560 BC, is aligned to true north with an accuracy of 3/60 of a single degree, a precision that modern surveyors with laser equipment struggle to match. The four shafts inside the pyramid point towards specific stars. The southern shaft from the king's chamber targets Orion's belt associated with Osiris. The northern shaft aligns with Thuban, the pole star of that era. But the pyramid's alignment suggests something more troubling. If you trace the precession of the equinoxes backward, the 26,000-year wobble of Earth's axis that slowly shifts which stars appear, where the pyramid's stellar alignments become perfect around 10,500 BC. Robert Bauval and Graham Hancock proposed that the Giza layout mirrors the constellation Orion as it appeared in that epoch. Even the megalithic sites, the ones that predated writing, showed evidence of sophisticated geometric and astronomical understanding appearing suddenly with no visible learning curve. Someone somewhere before the floods and the climate catastrophes and the extinctions had developed these systems. And when their world ended, the knowledge survived in fragments carried by refugees, preserved in myths, encoded in temple plans, and slowly rebuilt by descendants who no longer remembered who had taught their ancestors. Only that the knowledge was sacred and must not be lost. What then happened to that remembered world? The one that created the original templates, developed the astronomical systems, designed the sacred geometry. Why did it disappear so completely that only its echoes remain, whispered through the mouths of priests who claimed they were copying, not creating? The world didn't end all at once. It unraveled slowly over thousands of years until the memory of what came before faded into myth and then into silence. Between 12,000 and 6,000 BC, Earth underwent a transformation so complete that humanity's relationship with the planet fundamentally changed. And in that transformation, an entire epoch of human history was erased. Not deliberately, but inevitably, the way a rising tide washes away footprints in sand. It began with the climate. Around 10,800 BC, just as the world was warming and glaciers were retreating, temperatures suddenly plunged. The Younger Dryas period brought 1,000 years of renewed cold, not gradual cooling, but a rapid descent back toward Ice Age conditions within decades. Paleoclimatic data suggests average temperatures dropped by up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit in some regions. Glaciers that had been melting began advancing again. Rainfall patterns shifted. Ecosystems collapsed. Some researchers propose an extraterrestrial cause, a comet or meteor impact that destabilized the climate system, possibly striking the Laurentide ice sheet over North America and triggering massive meltwater releases into the Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents. Evidence includes a thin layer of platinum and microscopic diamonds in sediment cores, dated to the Younger Dryas boundary, signatures consistent with cosmic impact. Geological surveys have identified possible impact craters in Greenland dating to this period. Whether caused by impact, volcanic eruptions, or shifts in ocean circulation, the effect was catastrophic. The ecosystems that Ice Age humans had adapted to for millennia suddenly became unstable. Food sources collapsed. Megafauna, woolly mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats went extinct, taking with them the hunting traditions that had sustained human populations for thousands of years. Then came the floods. As the Younger Dryas ended around 9,600 BC, the climate didn't gradually stabilize. It lurched violently back toward warmth. Glaciers melted catastrophically. Meltwater Pulse 1b sent torrents of water into the oceans. Sea levels surged. And since approximately 70% of human populations throughout history have lived within 50 miles of coastlines, the rising waters didn't just reshape geography, they drowned civilizations. Imagine it from the perspective of someone living on a coastal plain in 10,000 BC. Your grandparents told you about a time when the world was colder, when great herds of mammoths roamed the grasslands, but those herds are gone now. The climate is changing, and every generation the sea creeps closer. The fishing grounds your ancestors knew are now deep underwater. The river valleys where your people settled for centuries are flooding, becoming estuaries, then bays, then open ocean. You retreat inland, but millions of others are doing the same. Competition for resources intensifies, trade networks collapse, villages fragment, and in the chaos, knowledge is lost. Because knowledge requires stability to preserve. Writing systems need scribes trained across generations. Astronomical observations require unbroken chains of record-keeping. Architectural knowledge requires master builders teaching apprentices. Medical traditions need practitioners passing down techniques. When societies collapse, these transmission chains break. Within a generation or two, sophisticated knowledge degrades into fragments. Within a few more generations, it becomes myth. And the coastal settlements, the places where the most advanced Ice Age societies likely flourished, where maritime trade networks connected distant regions, where populations were densest and knowledge most concentrated, all of it now lies beneath hundreds of feet of water, archaeologically invisible. This is why the prehistoric world vanished so completely, not because it never existed, but because it existed in precisely the places the floods consumed. Mass migrations followed the rising seas. Genetic studies show massive population movements during this period, waves of migration radiating outward from coastlines as people fled inland, displacing existing populations, creating conflicts, fragmenting cultures. Languages diverged, traditions splintered. The shared knowledge networks that might have spanned continents broke into isolated pockets. Meanwhile, food production systems collapsed. Late Ice Age societies had developed sophisticated seasonal migration patterns, exploiting resources along coastlines, river valleys, and inland hunting grounds. As sea levels rose and climates shifted, these patterns became untenable. Fishing grounds disappeared, seasonal camps flooded, migration routes were cut off. Populations that had numbered in the thousands condensed into smaller, more desperate groups fighting over shrinking territories. And in the midst of this chaos, writing, if it existed before the floods, was lost. There is a reason the earliest writing we recognize dates to 3500 BC. It's not because humans couldn't conceive of writing earlier. It's because writing requires surplus, stable food production, settled populations, administrative need, and educational infrastructure to train scribes. All of this requires societal stability. When stability collapses, writing vanishes. And without writing, knowledge becomes oral tradition. And oral tradition over enough generations becomes myth. The myths themselves preserve the trauma. Across every tradition, the same phrases appear. The gods left. Sumerian texts describe the Apkallu departing after the flood, their teachings preserved, but their presence gone. Egyptian inscriptions speak of the Neteru withdrawing at the end of Zeptepi. Hindu traditions describe the sages ascending after imparting knowledge. Greek myths tell of the gods abandoning humanity to fend for itself. The world was drowned, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Every tradition describes water consuming the earth, coastlines vanishing, and populations drowning. The details vary, but the core memory remains identical. A world-ending flood that separated before from after. Humanity began again. The survivors in every tradition describe themselves as remnants, a handful of people who escaped the catastrophe and had to rebuild from fragments. Noah, Utnapishtim, Manu, Deucalion, Gun. Different names for the same archetype, the survivor who carries forward knowledge from the drowned world into the new one. These aren't just stories, they're compressed historical memory. The way a people traumatized by generational catastrophe tries to explain why everything changed, why the old world is gone, why the knowledge they possess feels incomplete, inherited, rather than created. We realize now that the 6,000-year records are not early chapters of human civilization. They're the aftershock of a forgotten world, the moment when survivors finally regained enough stability to write down what their ancestors had carried orally through centuries of chaos. The Sumerian tablets, Egyptian inscriptions, megalithic temples, all of them are reconstruction efforts, humanity trying desperately to remember what had been lost. The Great Forgetting wasn't a single event. It was a cascading collapse that took millennia. Floods drowning coastlines, climate chaos disrupting food production, populations fragmenting, languages diverging, knowledge degrading from science to tradition, to myth, to silence. By the time civilizations re-emerged around 3,500 BC, the memory of what came before had faded so completely that even the survivors' descendants no longer knew what they were remembering. They called it the time of the gods, the first time, the age before the flood. They built temples according to ancient plans they no longer fully understood. They copied astronomical observations they couldn't explain. They wrote in languages that appeared complete because someone somewhere long ago had designed them, and then they too began to forget. If humanity forgot once, if an entire epoch of human achievement was erased so thoroughly that only myths and fragments remain, then what evidence still lies waiting for us to recover? And how much of what we call the beginning is actually just the faint echo of an ending we never witnessed? The evidence doesn't whisper anymore. It speaks clearly if you're willing to listen. When Sir Leonard Woolley dug through the ruins of Ur in 1922 and found the 8-foot flood layer, he noticed something that troubled him. The Sumerian tablets described exactly what he discovered, a catastrophic deluge that separated the world before from the world after. The geology matched the myth, not approximately precisely at Kish, the same flood stratum at Shurupak, the same deposit all dated to the same window between 3,500 and 2,900 BC, not seasonal river flooding catastrophic inundation that left sterile silt exactly where the ancient texts said it would be. But that was only the first alignment. The Sumerian king list described rulers before the flood with reigns lasting 28,000 to 36,000 years. Impossible, scholars said. Mythological exaggeration, but then Egyptian records surfaced showing the same pattern. Divine rulers with millennium-long reigns before the dynasties followed by gradually shortening lifespans after the flood. Then Hindu texts revealed yuga cycles spanning tens of thousands of years. The Maya records describe previous world ages, destroyed and reborn independent cultures separated by oceans, telling the same chronological story. And when geologists examined ice cores and sea level data, they found that between 12,000 and 6,000 BC, exactly the window these king lists and world age cycles described, Earth underwent transformation unlike anything in the subsequent 6,000 years. Meltwater pulses raising sea levels 400 feet. The Younger Dryas plunging temperatures back toward Ice Age conditions, coastlines drowning, ecosystems collapsing, megafauna going extinct. The geological timeline matched the mythological timeline, matched the textual timeline. Then came the astronomy. The Sumerian Venus tablets tracked planetary cycles with precision that required centuries of observation, yet appeared in the earliest written records fully formed. Egyptian temples aligned to stars with accuracy modern surveyors struggle to replicate. Göbekli Tepe's pillars encoded constellations 11,600 years ago, 6,000 years before writing supposedly existed. Nabta Playa's stone circle tracks celestial mechanics in 6,000 BC, long before any civilization should have possessed such knowledge. These weren't crude first attempts. They were refined systems, showing no learning curve, no developmental stages, only completion, as if someone had been watching the sky for thousands of years, and simply wrote down what they'd always known. The languages told the same story. Sumerian appears with no parent language, no transitional forms, no linguistic evolution, just a fully functional system capable of expressing complex legal, astronomical, and medical concepts. Egyptian hieroglyphics emerge complete with 700 distinct signs and grammatical sophistication from their first appearance. The Indus script arrives fully formed and remains undeciphered precisely because it has no obvious linguistic relatives. Every major early writing system behaves as if it were restored, not invented. And the temples, those massive stone structures that should represent humanity's first clumsy attempts at monumental architecture, appear instead as geometrically sophisticated, astronomically aligned, mathematically precise constructions that explicitly claim to be copies of older designs. Egyptian inscriptions state they followed plans from Tepe the first time. Sumerian texts claim temples were built after the pattern shown in the heavens. Even Göbekli Tepe, built in 9600 BC by people who supposedly hadn't invented agriculture, shows evidence of geometric planning and astronomical knowledge that required multi-generational coordination. The megaliths were older than the civilizations we credit with inventing civilization. And the myths, those stories dismissed as primitive religious fantasy, preserved the same sequence across every continent. An advanced world existed. A catastrophic flood destroyed it. Survivors carried fragments of knowledge forward. And humanity rebuilt slowly from memory, not borrowed stories, independent preservation of the same historical trauma. The pattern was undeniable. Every line of evidence pointed in the same direction. Geological catastrophe between 12,000 and 6,000 BC that matches ancient flood traditions. King lists describing impossibly ancient pre-flood rulers whose timelines align with the prehistoric period. Astronomical knowledge appearing complete at civilization's beginning rather than developing gradually. Languages with no childhood, temples claiming to restore rather than create. Myths worldwide describing the same lost epoch. None of these pieces of evidence meant much in isolation. But together, they formed a picture that conventional history couldn't accommodate. The 6,000-year records we've been calling the beginning of civilization. The Sumerian tablets, Egyptian inscriptions, megalithic sites were never describing humanity's first steps toward knowledge. They were describing what came after. After the floods drowned the coastlines where most humans lived. After the climate chaos collapsed Ice Age societies. After the mass migrations fractured cultural continuity. After the knowledge systems that had taken millennia to develop degraded into oral tradition, then into myth, then into barely remembered fragments. The earliest civilizations weren't starting from zero. They were rebuilding from ruins, both physical and intellectual. They were survivors of a cultural collapse so complete that by the time they could write again, they'd forgotten the details of what came before. All they knew was that knowledge had been greater once, that ancestors possessed wisdom they no longer fully understood, that the world before the flood was different, older, and now lost beneath rising seas and fading memory. This is why Sumer appears suddenly with irrigation networks, law codes, and astronomical precision, not because they invented these systems overnight, but because they were reconstructing them from inherited knowledge. This is why Egyptian hieroglyphics arrive complete. Because the priests were restoring a writing system their distant ancestors had developed before the catastrophes. This is why temples worldwide share geometric principles and astronomical alignments, because they were all following fragments of the same ancient template, preserved through different cultural traditions, but originating from a common source. This is why flood myths repeat the same story, because they were all remembering the same event, the catastrophic end of the world that came before ours. The 6,000-year records are not describing the beginning of civilization. They are describing the end of its predecessor. Humanity is not the first civilization, only the latest one able to write down its fear of forgetting. We stand now 6,000 years after Sumer with technology and knowledge that would seem godlike to our ancestors. We've mapped the genome, split the atom, walked on the moon. We've built cities that house millions and communication networks that span the globe instantaneously. And yet, beneath our feet, beneath hundreds of feet of ocean water on continental shelves worldwide, lie the drowned remnants of the world that came before ours. A world that may have achieved its own sophistication, developed its own knowledge systems, built its own cities, only to have it all erased when the earth convulsed and the seas rose and the climate fractured. We are not starting from scratch. We are continuing something interrupted. The records that should not exist, the star charts too precise for beginners, the languages with no childhood, the temples built from memory, the myths that remember what geology confirms, they're all telling us the same thing. We've been here before. Not us specifically, but humanity. We've risen before. We've built before. We've forgotten before. And the question those ancient records pose across 6,000 years of silence is not just about the past. It's about the future. If we are the inheritors of a world destroyed once before, a civilization that rose, flourished, and was erased so completely that only fragments and myths survived, then how long before history repeats itself? How long before our own records become the mysterious artifacts that future archaeologists dig from the ruins, wondering how we knew so much and why we disappeared? The 6,000-year records were warnings, memories preserved by survivors, desperate to ensure their descendants would know what had been lost. Now, we're the descendants. We've recovered the message. The only question left is whether we're willing to hear, suggesting either the pyramids encoded knowledge of a much earlier astronomical arrangement, or they were built according to plans that dated back to that period. Egyptologists dismissed the theory, but they couldn't dismiss the knowledge of precession itself, something the ancient Egyptians demonstrably possessed, even though discovering precession requires tracking stellar positions across multiple centuries. The Greek astronomer Hipparchus is credited with discovering precession around 150 BC. Yet Egyptian temple alignments and the Dendera zodiac suggest awareness of precessional cycles thousands of years earlier. Then archaeologists began finding observatories that predated civilization altogether. In the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, a site called Nabta Playa sits silent beneath the sun. Discovered in 1974, it contains a stone circle dated to approximately 6,000 BC, making it 1,000 years older than Stonehenge. The megaliths are arranged to track the summer solstice and cardinal directions. Nearby, underground chambers contain massive stone slabs aligned with Orion's belt. At 6,000 BC, this was supposedly the Neolithic period, simple farming communities just learning to organize. Yet here stood an astronomical observatory requiring sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, geometric planning, and multi-generational coordination to construct and maintain. Göbekli Tepe presented an even earlier mystery. When Klaus Schmidt excavated the site's T-shaped pillars, he found them covered with carved reliefs, not just animals, but symbols. One pillar, known as the Vulture Stone, or Pillar 43, contains what appears to be a star chart. University of Edinburgh researchers analyzed the symbols and concluded they represent constellations. A scorpion corresponding to Scorpius, a vulture to Sagittarius, circles and crescent, possibly depicting a comet or meteor impact. Radiocarbon dating placed the pillar's creation at approximately 10,950 BC, making it potentially the oldest known astronomical record in human history. If the researchers are correct, then Stone Age hunter-gatherers possessed knowledge of constellations, celestial mapping, and possibly even the documentation of catastrophic astronomical events. 11,000 years before writing was supposedly invented, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. astronomical knowledge appearing too early, too complete, and too widely distributed to represent independent discovery. In 1929, Turkish Admiral Piri Reis produced a world map compiled from older source maps, some allegedly dating to the time of Alexander the Great or earlier. The Piri Reis map shows the Atlantic coast of South America, the coast of West Africa, and, controversially, what appears to be the northern coastline of Antarctica, rendered without ice. Skeptics immediately pointed out that Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and its coast beneath the ice wasn't mapped until the 1950s using seismic sounding. How could a 16th century map show Antarctic coastlines as they would appear without glacial coverage? A condition that hasn't existed since before 4000 BC. Scholars remain divided. Some argue it's a cartographic coincidence or misidentification. Others point out that Piri Reis explicitly stated he compiled his map from over 20 older source maps, some from the Library of Alexandria. If accurate coastlines of ice-free Antarctica existed in ancient maps, it would imply that someone had surveyed and charted those coasts during the last period they were accessible over 6,000 years ago. Regardless of the map's authenticity, the broader pattern holds. Ancient civilizations possessed geographical and astronomical knowledge that required centuries of systematic observation and data collection. Yet this knowledge appears suddenly in the historical record with no visible learning curve. Precession knowledge is perhaps the most troubling example. Understanding the Earth's axis wobbles over a 26,000-year cycle requires tracking the positions of stars relative to the horizon across multiple human lifetimes, ideally centuries. Yet this knowledge appears encoded in myths and monuments far earlier than it should. The Sphinx's eastward gaze aligns with the constellation Leo during the Age of Leo, roughly 10,500 BC. Hindu and Maya calendars track world ages in precessional intervals. The ancient Greek poet Hesiod described 5 ages of man spanning vast epochs. Even the biblical account of the patriarchs living hundreds of years might encode precessional ages rather than literal lifespans. These weren't crude observations. They represented sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics passed down through cultures separated by continents and millennia. And then there's the question no one wants to ask. If these early civilizations didn't discover this knowledge themselves, if it appears too suddenly, too complete, then where did it come from? The only logical answer is inheritance. Somewhere at some point before the historical civilizations we recognize, someone spent centuries watching the sky, recording patterns, calculating cycles, and passing that information forward. When the floods came and the old world drowned, this knowledge survived, carried in oral traditions, encoded in myths, preserved in temple alignments, and eventually written down by cultures who no longer remembered why they knew what they knew. The Sumerians didn't invent the Venus cycle, they remembered it. The Egyptians didn't discover precession, they inherited it. Göbekli Tepe's builders didn't create star charts from scratch. They were documenting what they had been taught. If early humanity remembered the sky so precisely, tracking planets, encoding constellations, preserving knowledge of precessional ages spanning tens of thousands of years, then what else did they remember? What other knowledge survived the flood, waiting to be recognized in the ruins they left behind? Language is supposed to evolve slowly, messily, with false starts and dead ends preserved in the archaeological record like fossils in stone. But when linguists examined humanity's oldest writing systems, they found something that violated every principle of linguistic evolution. Languages appearing fully formed with no ancestors, no transitional phases, no gradual sophistication. They arrived complete as if someone had simply switched them on. Take Sumerian. When cuneiform tablets first emerge around 3,500 BC, the language encoded within them shows no developmental history. Linguists have spent over a century searching for Sumerian's parent language, some earlier form from which it evolved. They found nothing. Sumerian is a linguistic isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, no linguistic family tree, no obvious connections to any other language on Earth. It simply appears in southern Mesopotamia, fully functional with complex grammar, extensive vocabulary, and sophisticated literary conventions already in place. By the time we encounter Sumerian in writing, it's already being used to compose legal codes, astronomical records, medical texts, religious hymns, and administrative documents. This isn't a language in its infancy. It's a mature system capable of expressing abstract thought, technical precision, and poetic nuance. And here's what makes it stranger. Sumerian doesn't behave like a language that's still figuring itself out. Early Sumerian tablets show no spelling inconsistencies, no grammatical uncertainty, no signs that scribes were experimenting with how to represent sounds or concepts. The system arrives complete, as if the scribes were copying from an older template they already understood. Egyptian hieroglyphics present the same mystery. When hieroglyphic writing appears around 3200 BC, it emerges as a fully developed system with over 700 distinct signs, grammatical rules, phonetic components, and ideographic symbols working in harmony. There are no primitive earlier versions, no gradual evolution from simple pictograms to complex writing. Egyptologists have searched for proto-hieroglyphic stages, evidence of Egyptians experimenting with visual communication before settling on the hieroglyphic system. They found almost nothing. A few painted symbols on pottery, some geometric marks on ceremonial items, but no clear developmental sequence leading to the sophistication of early hieroglyphics. It's as if hieroglyphic writing was designed all at once, implemented system-wide, and immediately used to record complex religious texts, astronomical observations, and administrative records. And like Sumerian, Egyptian hieroglyphics remain consistent across centuries. The signs carved into Old Kingdom temples around 2500 BC would still be readable to scribes working 2,000 years later. The system didn't need refinement because it arrived refined. Meanwhile, linguists studying Proto-Indo-European, the reconstructed ancestor language of most European and many Asian languages, kept pushing its origins further back in time. Initially, they estimated Proto-Indo-European arose around 4000 BC, somewhere in the steppes north of the Black Sea. But as more linguistic data accumulated, the timeline stretched backward. Some researchers now argue for origins as early as 7000 BC or earlier, possibly tied to Neolithic Anatolia. But here's the problem. Proto-Indo-European itself shows signs of having descended from something older. Its vocabulary contains words for advanced concepts, agriculture, domesticated animals, wheeled vehicles, structured kinship systems. This wasn't a language spoken by primitive hunter-gatherers. It was spoken by organized societies with established technologies, which raises the question, what came before Proto-Indo-European? What earlier linguistic system gave rise to a language family that would eventually spawn Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Persian, Celtic, Germanic, and Slavic languages? The trail goes cold. Just like with Sumerian and Egyptian, the deeper you dig, the more the origins vanish into a prehistorical mist. Then there's the Indus Valley script. Around 2600 BC, the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley began producing seals inscribed with a script that remains undeciphered to this day. The symbols appear on thousands of artifacts, seals, pottery, tablets, suggesting widespread literacy and administrative use. The script shows internal consistency, repeated patterns, and apparent grammatical structure. Yet it has no obvious connection to any known language family. No Rosetta Stone exists to unlock it. And most troubling, it appears suddenly in the archaeological record fully formed with no visible evolutionary development. 4 ancient writing systems, Sumerian, Egyptian, Proto-Indus, and Chinese oracle bone script, all emerge within a relatively narrow window between 3500 and 1200 BC. All appear complete upon first appearance. All lack clear ancestral forms, and all were used by civilizations that showed other signs of inheriting rather than inventing their knowledge. But the languages themselves weren't the only clue that something had been passed down. Many of these writing systems explicitly describe themselves as recovered, not created. Egyptian texts claim that Thoth, the god of wisdom, gave writing to humanity. Sumerian traditions credit the Apkallu, the 7 sages who emerged after the flood, with teaching civilization, including written language. Hindu texts describe the Devanagari script as divine in origin given by the gods. Even the Hebrew tradition maintains that the alphabet was a gift from the divine, not a human invention. Modern scholars dismiss these accounts as mythological origin stories. Every culture attributes its writing to gods or heroes. But what if these stories preserve a memory of linguistic transmission? What if the gods taught us was an ancient way of saying, we learned this from those who came before? Meanwhile, archaeologists examining temple inscriptions found something equally revealing. At Edfu in Egypt, priests recorded that their temple was built according to the specification laid down in the time of the ancestors. At Dendera, inscriptions claimed the zodiac ceiling was copied from plans written on goatskin scrolls from the time of the followers of Horus, a pre-dynastic epoch. Sumerian temple dedications frequently state that structures were built according to the sacred plan or after the pattern shown from the heavens. These weren't metaphors. The texts describe following blueprints, copying measurements, restoring what had been lost. Even Göbekli Tepe, built 9600 BC, shows evidence of geometric planning that suggests knowledge of precise angles and astronomical alignments. Someone designed those pillars according to a system. But where did that system come from? The pattern was unmistakable. Civilizations claiming to restore rather than create. Languages appearing complete rather than evolving. Writing systems with no childhood. Temple plans copied from older sources. Everything pointed backward toward something lost. If Sumer inherited its language from an earlier people, who were they? If Egyptian hieroglyphics arrived complete, who designed the system? If temple builders followed ancient plans, who drew the originals? If writing was restored after the flood, what world had created it first? The evidence suggested that the 6,000-year records we call the beginning of civilization were actually the remnants of something older. Fragments of a linguistic and architectural tradition that survived the catastrophe, carried forward by survivors who no longer fully understood what they were preserving, but knew it was too important to let die. If their languages were inherited and their temples were copies, if even their writing systems were restorations of older patterns, then what original world were they imitating? And why does every trace of it vanish before 10,000 BC, leaving only echoes in the minds of those who came after? The architects left behind confessions carved in stone, admissions that what they were building was not new, but remembered. At the Temple of Horus in Edfu, Egypt, hieroglyphic inscriptions cover the walls with unusual precision. Among the dedication texts, one passage stands out. The temple was built according to a plan that came down from the great primordial age. The priests insisted they were not innovating. They were following specifications from Zep-Tepi, the first time an epoch when gods walked the earth and the foundations of all sacred knowledge were laid at Dendera. Another temple inscription goes further. It claims the building's design was copied from drawings made on goatskin scrolls from the days of the followers of Horus, a pre-dynastic period stretching back before the first pharaohs. The implication was clear. The priests saw themselves as custodians of ancient knowledge, not creators of it. Their role was to preserve, replicate, and transmit what had been handed down from an age they called divine, but described in strikingly concrete terms. Across Mesopotamia, Sumerian temple dedications carried the same tone. Inscriptions at Eridu, Nippur, and Uruk describe temples built after the pattern shown in the heavens or according to the writing of the sky. One text from Lagash states that the temple of Ningirsu was constructed based on a divine plan given in a dream, but the measurements, angles, and orientations were described with mathematical precision. These weren't vague visions. They were architectural blueprints transmitted through oral tradition, encoded in myth, and preserved as sacred duty. The idea that temples were restorations rather than inventions appears across virtually every early civilization, not as poetic metaphor, but as documented architectural philosophy. And when archaeologists began measuring these structures, they found something impossible to dismiss: geometric and astronomical precision that appeared simultaneously across cultures separated by thousands of miles. Take the pyramid complexes. The Great Pyramid at Giza incorporates the mathematical constant pi in its dimensions. The ratio of its perimeter to its height approximates 2 pi. The same structure encodes the proportions of Earth's hemisphere when scaled. It aligns to true north within a fraction of a degree. It sits at a latitude that places it 1/3 of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. In Mesoamerica, the Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan uses nearly identical base dimensions to the Great Pyramid. Despite being built by a culture with no known contact with Egypt, both structures employ similar geometric principles. Both align to cardinal directions with extreme precision. Both incorporate astronomical observations into their design. Halfway around the world, Angkor Wat in Cambodia mirrors the layout of the constellation Draco as it appeared around 10,500 BC, the same epoch suggested by the Giza-Orion correlation. Temples across India, Southeast Asia, and Indonesia share architectural principles, sacred geometry, cardinal alignments, astronomical orientations that suggest not independent invention, but transmission of shared knowledge. The megalithic sites show the same pattern. Stonehenge in England aligns to the summer solstice. Newgrange in Ireland aligns to the winter solstice. The stone circles at Avebury, Karnak, and dozens of other European sites incorporate solar, lunar, and stellar alignments with precision that requires multi-generational observation and planning. But these weren't the oldest. Göbekli Tepe, dated to 9,600 BC, predates them all, and it may be the most revealing. The site's massive T-shaped pillars are arranged in circular formations, each weighing up to 20 tons, quarried and transported without metal tools or domesticated animals. The pillars display carvings of animals, foxes, scorpions, snakes, birds, but also geometric symbols, circles, H-shapes, crescent. Some researchers interpret these as astronomical markers. Pillar 43, the vulture stone, appears to encode constellations and possibly a comet impact event. What's most troubling about Göbekli Tepe isn't just its age or sophistication, it's what happened to it. After flourishing for over 1,000 years, the entire complex was deliberately buried, intentionally filled in with rubble and earth, preserved beneath the ground like a time capsule. Whoever built it chose to hide it, rather than let it decay naturally, as if the knowledge it represented needed to be protected, even if the people who understood it were disappearing. Klaus Schmidt, the site's excavator, noted that Göbekli Tepe had no developmental precursor. It appears suddenly, fully realized, and then vanishes just as abruptly. No transitional architecture, no gradual evolution, just a burst of sophistication followed by intentional burial and cultural silence. The same pattern appears in the myths across the ancient world separated by oceans and continents. Cultures describe the same architectural tradition, transmitted by the same archetypal figures, gods or sages, descending from the sky or emerging from the waters to teach humanity sacred knowledge. In Sumer, the Apkallu, 7 sages who appeared after the flood taught city building, temple construction, and sacred geometry. In Egypt, Thoth and the followers of Horus transmitted divine architecture during Zep Tepi. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, arrived from across the sea to teach pyramid building and astronomy. In India, the Saptarishi, 7 sages descended to restore civilization after the deluge, bringing with them the Vedic knowledge encoded in temple architecture. In Peru, Viracocha emerged from Lake Titicaca to teach stonework and agriculture. Different names, different cultures, same story structure, advanced knowledge transmitted by non-human or semi-divine teachers who arrive after a catastrophe to help humanity rebuild, and the temples themselves preserve these motifs in stone. The sacred tree appears in Sumerian cylinder seals, Egyptian temple reliefs, Hindu cosmology, Norse mythology, and Mesoamerican art, always depicted as the axis connecting heaven and earth, the channel through which divine knowledge flows. The cosmic mountain, the ziggurat, the pyramid, the step temple appears in Mesopotamia, Egypt, Mesoamerica, Southeast Asia, and the Andes. Same concept, a structure connecting the earthly realm to the celestial, built according to geometric principles that mirror the heavens. The sky gods teaching humanity appear in every tradition. Anu and Enki in Sumer, Ra and Thoth in Egypt, Brahma and Vishnu in India, Zeus and Prometheus in Greece. Not local variations on a theme, but a shared memory encoded in different languages passed down through cultures that claim these teachers appeared after a great catastrophe to restore what had been lost. All signs pointed toward a civilization that was not inventing, but remembering. The temples weren't original designs. They were reconstructions based on plans passed down from before the flood. The languages weren't new creations. They were restorations of older systems. The astronomical knowledge wasn't discovered through patient observation. It was inherited from survivors who carried it forward through generations of oral tradition before finally committing it to clay and stone.